So our next session is post-COVID-19. What does the world look like? And joining us is Senior Vice President, Growth Markets, South Asia, China, ASEAN, Japan, and Global Head Medical Devices from Indegene, India. Hope I pronounced this right. Marut Setia. That's my Aussie accent. Hopefully I've got it right. Marut, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me here. So listen, I was thinking a lot about how do I start this session, because post-COVID, nobody knows how it's going to look like. But one thing is for sure, if we are not able to eradicate TB in 9,000 years, and we haven't seen a post-cholera world or a post-malaria world, I don't know if COVID is ever going to go away. I'm not trying to paint a pessimistic picture here, but what I'm trying to say is that we need to get used to some of the impact that COVID has created in our world, right? So the markets, they will continue to be turbulent for at least as long as I can see. Your customers are going to be very demanding in terms of digital solutions. They are going to ask you for innovative ideas on how do they move into the post-COVID world, if you will. Your marketing dollars, they will definitely continue to see a shift from the older models to a digital model. Your innovation engine will learn how to adapt to this post-COVID digital world. So all of these trends that you see today, and some we used to dismiss early on, especially in the healthcare space, are here to stay. So when we start thinking about our strategies, when we start designing how our future is going to look like, we need to make sure that we stay cognizant of the fact that some of these things may not change for good ever. What I'm going to do today is, in next 10 to 15 minutes, just talk to you a little bit about how we are seeing this trend and shift in healthcare, and how post-COVID world, how things are going to be impacted in 4 major buckets. So before we go there, just, when we think about consumers, in the healthcare space, a few months back, we used to shortchange the trends that we saw in the larger ecosystem. And we always used to say that, it's great that Amazon is doing it, but it does not work for the healthcare space, because our target market is very, very different. Our consumers are extremely different and nuanced. And maybe these trends do not apply 100% to our world. And to some extent, we were all right. But now, the boundary between your personal life and professional life has really suddenly gone away. And we are realizing that HCPs or healthcare professionals are just like any other consumers. And they are now waking up to the efficiencies that are brought in by digital networks through digital interventions. So now when we start thinking about the marketing strategies, we start thinking about an omni-channel approach. While face-to-face interactions are not going to go away, how do we connect a digital interaction to an in-person or a remote interaction is going to determine how successful as marketeers we are going to be. And then you add to that the regulatory challenges that specifically our world faces, and the amount of regulation and the pace of regulation has suddenly heightened in next 6 months. People and governments are waking up to new challenges that using a digital technology brings in, and the regulation is trying to evolve much faster than ever seen before. So we used to talk about EU MDR as one of the big challenges. Now we're talking about regulations around teleconsultation. The amount of business that teleconsultation has generated in US has just gone up 6 times, and in emerging markets, it's even actually faster. The adoption of technology even faster. So all of this has to be taken into cognizance when we start thinking about a world which is even 6 months down in the future. So this is how when we at Indegene, when we start thinking about a post-COVID world, we kind of create these 3 scenarios. Now, every country will probably go through a different form of control, but will settle down in one of the 3 outputs, if you see. And irrespective of where you end up as a country or as a region, your new mix of targeting the customer is going to be drastically different than your older mix. Your face-to-face interactions will go down irrespective, right? Now, would they go down from 70% to 50% or to 20%? That's the only question that as a marketer, as a business leader, you need to answer for yourself, right? So at Indegene, we are now trying to make sure that we are prepared for all these three scenarios. And again, like I said earlier, the answer to winning this game is not going to be on how effectively you use digital or how effectively you use the remote technology, but it's going to be in how effectively did you create a holistic environment, a customer journey which passes on the baton from one to the other as seamlessly as possible. And that is what's going to go and win the game for you, for your organization, as a marketer or as a marketing function. So let me quickly jump into these four pieces which we feel are the big pillars in a healthcare industry, right? So when you think of evolution of a healthcare industry from a pharma standpoint or from a healthcare provider standpoint, you think of four big buckets. How do you focus on your R&D? What's going to change in your R&D cycle? So your clinical trials. How are your patients and your consumer behavior going to change? How is healthcare providers, how are they going to shift? And then how do the commercial model look like in the post-COVID world? So I'm going to quickly take a couple of minutes on each of these and talk you through how we are thinking about these models as they evolve. So on the clinical trial, think of it like this. In 6 months before, to get to a trial, number of patients in a trial, you probably had to go to 3, 4, 5 hospitals. You had physical in-person people there who would help the doctors and the patients to collect the right trial data, which was back submitted into to the pharma company, and you were able to complete those trials. Now you are looking at a world where patient load in each of these provider spaces has gone down significantly. It is even more complex, or it is even the complexity increases when you think about specialty drugs. The world is moving into drugs which are more specific rather than generics or broad-based segments, and you realize that those going to those 5 hospitals, 1 country, 5 states is just not enough anymore. So patient recruitment has become a huge challenge. How do you make sure that you have the right trial population? And then all of this amounts to delay in the launch of a drug, which ultimately means dollars. If you are not able to commercialize on time, you ultimately end up putting in a lot more pressure on your bottom line than you otherwise would. So the world has now started moving into what we are calling digital trials. Digital trial was, to be honest with you, an idea a couple of years back for which the time had not come. And suddenly we are seeing the number of companies talking about adapting and getting into those models faster is just phenomenal. The number of companies, the discussions that we're having around this has just become phenomenal. And ultimately, it all boils down to one factor, that without having to excessively risk your human capital or without depending on the human capital, you are now able to complete a trial for a drug across the globe, and 80% of the workload has moved digital. Now, this obviously again requires a lot of regulations to catch up, but ultimately what we see that this trend will continue, and it just has been accelerated by COVID. So everything that was an idea in a very infancy kind of a stage has now suddenly grown up really, really fast. So that's on the clinical trials. On the patients, if you really think about now, obviously every country has seen a different level of response, but broadly, 50 to 70% of procedures which were at one point considered as a given from a provider standpoint have been cut. Either patients are postponing those elective surgeries, if you will, or even the providers who are now under a huge amount of stress to deal with these communicable diseases are trying to push it and postpone it. So what that means is that the hospitals have to start thinking about new models to generate revenue. They have to attract the right patient section, which means their whole marketing, the marketing engine has to rethink on how they can get the right patients into the hospitals, and they have to sustain, right? At least in India and some parts of Middle East, we are seeing a lot of these providers actually shutting shop. because of lack of remuneration and lack of lucrative remuneration that they used to get through some of these elective surgeries. And this trend is going to continue to put a lot of pressure on the providers end. And marketers are kind of have been tasked to find an answer for that, which is short of saying let's go digital. It's very difficult to kind of sustain. To that end, the growth of telemedicine has come as some kind of a solution to the depleting revenue that the provider space is seeing. In US alone, we have seen a threefold increase in telemedicine and in adoption. In India, the number of platforms that have been launched for telemedicine over the last 6 months has been more than ever in the history of the country. So you are seeing a lot of these solutions that are popping up with limited tech stacks. So as these telemedicine these solutions become more mainstream, the question on how do you attract consumer to this, how do you create Amazon kind of models to attract patients and users to these platforms will become sacrosanct for any marketer who's kind of engaged in these kind of solutions. So that's the trend we are seeing. The trend of moving away from in-hospital kind of visits to more telemedicine kind of solutions is going to fundamentally change the way hospitals market themselves. And that's one of the trends that we are seeing across the board. The third piece is the impact on the providers. I mean, I spoke a little bit about it. We always used to think of hospitals as a separate segment. We used to think of it as a B2B kind of a market. But more and more we are realizing that when pharma companies need to reach out to these hospitals, they still have to reach out to these doctors. So the thought process has evolved from this being a B2B space to more a B2C space, right? So pharma companies are now thinking about how do you create new solutions to engage with these doctors? How do you create new solutions to engage with patients? The amount of effort that a pharma company now spends to drive adherence of a drug or a therapy with the patients is very, very different from what we have seen in the past. And all of this is changing the way we look at marketing from a pharmaceutical company standpoint to either the hospitals or the HCPs. The last piece I'm going to talk about is how the commercial models are changing. We were in pharma and more in pharma, less in healthcare. We were always been a high touch model. We always thought about how does a rep go into a hospital, meets an HCP in person, how does a medical device professional go and explain the features of a machine to a radiologist and so on and so forth. But always the penetration of digital was always below 5 to 10%. Now in a post-COVID world, even though some of these things may go to a normal mode, this digital journey of an HCP is here to stay, right? The impact that the pharma company will see on their commercial model will obviously vary from on different kind of products. Is it a launch product, growth, mature, or a declining product? But the one thing is definitely for sure that digital marketing, digital consumption, digital adherence is all going to play a much larger role into these markets. And I'll just take one, in interest of time, I'll just take one example which may kind of resonate with all of you. When launching a product, a pharma company spends about 30% of their budgets into marketing, into promotion of those drugs. Largely, if you look at the mix, out of this 30%, less than 10 to 12% of the money was actually spent on digital channels, and more than 80 to 90% was actually spent in conferences, in symposiums, in educational grants to doctors. Now that model is going to more look like a 50-50 kind of a model where most of the engagements that you have with the healthcare professional or a doctor is going to move online, including knowledge transfer. So the new models of having a knowledge portal to engage with the HCP are going to take much more preference as compared to in-person model. Now I can keep going on and on, but in a nutshell, one, this world that we live in from a healthcare standpoint is going to have a fundamental shift. There is definitely going to be a shift which is going to be towards digital, but the success factor doesn't lie in moving your budgets from physical to digital model, but how well you create an engagement and a connection between your digital remote and in-person engagement and how well you capture that journey. I think that's what's going to determine the future of healthcare marketing in my world, at least. I'll stop there, take a pause, Tony, and see if it makes sense.